Shalom and welcome to Shomer Mitzvot, Torah Observant, a series on practical messianic living and apologetics. I'm the author, Torah Teacher Ariel ben-Lyman, HaNaviy. Torah observance is a matter of the heart. It always has been and always will be. The Torah proper instructed the people of Israel to love Adonai your God with all your heart, with all your being, and with all your resources. This is where Shomer Mitzvot begins, by loving HaShem and accepting Him on His terms. By this, I mean accepting His means of covenant obedience. For today, this means acceptance of Yeshua, His only Son, for Jew and non-Jew alike. Avinu Malkeinu, our Father, our King. Lord, we love you, and we thank you for bringing us safely to another session where we can study about you. We can study about the work that your Son has done for us through the power of the Spirit, the fellowship of the community of believers, both Jew and Gentile, who have been called out of darkness into your marvelous light. We know that we are called out for a reason, and so we would ask that you would help us to understand our purposes in these studies. It's not mere intellectual nutrition. Rather, we believe that you are equipping us for last day scenarios, things that are going to come to pass, perhaps shortly as you make your way back to earth. We thank you and we anticipate your coming. We pray that your Spirit will open the words of the text to us so that we can draw closer to you. And that we will learn how to also continue to draw closer to one another as we demonstrate, as you've promised, that the world will know that we are yours as we demonstrate love one for another. Help us to forgive one another and to extend mercy and kindness to one another. And let the world look on. Let them see you in us. Bless you, Father, for all of these wonderful mercies. And we'll be careful to recognize that it is your Son's authority that grants us this permission, Amen. Okay. Let's read the Shema. You'll have this perhaps next week if I can beat Mark to the printer. First passage, Deuteronomy 6, 4 through 9. Again, I'll read transliteration. You tell me if you hear anything different. Shema Yisrael, Adonai Eloheinu, Adonai Echad. Va'ahavta et Adonai Elohecha b'kol levavcha, v'kol nafshecha, v'kol me'odecha. V'hayu hadvarim ha'ileh asher anochi metzavcha hayom al levavecha, v'shinantam levanecha, v'dibarta bam b'shivteka b'veitecha uvlechtecha, v'derek uvshakpacha uvkumeka, ukshartam le'ot al yadecha, v'hayu letotafot bein einecha, uchtavtam al mezuzot beitecha uvisharecha. Second passage is Deuteronomy 11, 13 through 21. Translate shows up on the second page here. The first one was 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. 6 verses I just read there. The second one is 4 through 9. Mm-hmm. This next one is 13 through 21, so it'll be quite a bit longer. Out of Deuteronomy 11 this time. It reads, V'haya im shemo tishma'u el mitzvotai asher anochi mitzaveh etchem hayom la'ahava et Adonai Elohechem ul'avdo b'chol levavchem u'b'chol nafshochem v'natati matar artzakim be'eto yoreh u'malchosh v'savta d'ganecha v'turushdecha v'yitzharecha. I want to pause for a split second in the middle. It's something I don't usually do. Listen to when I say, you hear words that say blah 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 blah, cha, or blah 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 blah, echa. You're hearing a lot of those? Cha, cha, echa. Those are your endings. Whatever's in front of that is the object, and the echa is the Hebrew way of saying your whatever. So like, if this said bayit, which is house, then beitecha is your house, or this right here is a shulchan, it's a table. So if I just said shulchan with no ending, that's just table. But if I wanted to make you understand that this is your table, I would say Shulchan Echa. Shulchan Echa. So when you're hearing all these chas, if you go back and read the translation, it's God explaining to them your heart, your soul, your grain, your wine, your oil, your grass, your fields, your livestock, all these your, is what these echas are, in case you're wondering. Okay? Let's go again. V'haya im shemo tishmeu el mitzvotai asher anochi mitzaveh etchem hayom lahava et Adonai Elohechem ul'avdo b'chol levavchem u'b'chol nafshechem v'natati matar artzachem be'eto yore u'malchosh v'safta d'chanecha v'toroshtacha v'yitzcharecha v'natati esev b'sadcha livhemtecha v'acholta v'savata hi shamru lachem pen yiftei levavchem v'satem va'avatem Elohim acharim v'hishtakavitem lachem v'charaf af Adonai bachem v'atzar et ha-shamayim v'lo yiyeh matar v'ha'adama lo titein et yevula v'avadtem mechar mi'eh ha'aretz hatova asher Adonai noten lachem v'samtem et dvarai ele al lavavchem v'al nafshechem u'chshatam otam le'ot al yadechem v'hayu le'totofet bein einechem v'limadtem otam et benechem le'daber bam b'shivteka b'vetecha uv'lechtecha v'derek uv'shakapaka uv'chumecha. Lots of echaz there. U'chetavtam al mezuzot betecha uv'isharecha lema'an yirbu yimechem yimei v'nechem al ha'adama asher nishba Adonai la'avotechem matet lahem ki mei hashamayim al ha'aretz. And then the final passage is Numbers 15:37 through 41. It's kind of medium-sized. It reads, Vayomer Adonai el Moshe lemor, daber el bnei Yisrael va'amarta alehem, va'asu lahem tzitzit al kanfei vigdehem ladorotam v'natanu al tzitzit hakanaf patil tachelet, v'haya lechem letzitzit uritem oto, uskartem et kol mitzvot Adonai va'asitem otam, v'lo taturu achrei levavchem va'achrei einechem, asher atem nozonim achreihem, למען תזכרו ועשיתם את כל מצוותיי והייתם קדושים לאלוהיכם. אני אדוני אלוהיכם אשר הוצאתי אתכם מארץ מצרים לחיות לכם לאלוהים אני אדוני אלוהיכם. Amen. Powerful if you actually just decide to go back and do a study on those passages and look at all the promises that are packed in there for God's people if they will enter into covenant with Him and keep covenant with Him. We understand this kind of on two levels when we say enter into covenant and keep covenant with Him. Entering into covenant with Him requires a circumcised heart. That's something we know from our Sunday school classes, yes? That's true covenant, not just keeping, but true covenant existence. The circumcised heart is the softened heart that God can write His Spirit on, that God can move in, as it were. If we use Christian parlance, we would say that this is the heart that allows God to save you. But that's just the beginning of the covenant relationship with God. What God then does once He circumcises your heart, which is a monergistic work on God's part to open up your eyes so that you can make the choice to choose Yeshua, once God does that for you, He then also promised, and we know this to be true because Yeshua said so, He also then promises to empower us to begin to walk into the covenant that we just made with Him. So step one is the salvation process, and step two is the obedience. What ends up happening in standard Judaic circles, if I could just speak very generically, is that the circumcision of the heart gets skipped, it gets missed, it gets misunderstood, it gets overlooked, it gets minimized. Thus, true covenant relationship never begins for many Jewish people. True covenant relationship begins when one accepts that Yeshua is the promised Messiah found in the Torah that God gave to us. I'm using a little bit of Christianese here, right? But what ends up happening in standard Jewish circles is the obedience side of the coin, one coin, two sides. Let me just use this as my coin, right? This side of the coin that has the faith side, and this side has faithfulness, okay? The faith side is characterized by our faith in Jesus or salvation. The faithfulness side is characterized by our obedience to God's ways. And what God wants is the whole package for us. He wants us as a coin, to both take on faith, which is the circumcised heart, and then to walk in covenant faithfulness, walking into his ways. Ignorance of either of those sides of the coin will result in damage on our side as far as relationship. So standard Judaic side focuses on the covenant keeping side as far as obedience is concerned, walking in God's Torah. We got to do what the Torah says, we got to do it, we do it. But God says that unless you first have a circumcised heart, you can't be empowered to walk in the Torah in the first place. And in the end, your supposed Torah observance will fall flat because it's not motivated by something that's outside of you. This work on this side, the faith side, where God circumcises your heart, opens up your eyes, that's monergistic. God does it. Mon, one, ergon work. This side is a partnership between you and the Spirit of God. It's synergistic. So faith, faithfulness. We need them both. Jewish side of the I say Jewish, but you know what I mean. Historic Israel has maintained faithfulness to the covenant, but can't understand that genuine Torah keeping starts with a circumcised heart. The church, conversely, takes the opposite view of sorts. It's all about faith, brother. It's all about faith. Well, what about keeping the commandments? Oh, no. We're not under the law anymore. We're under grace. It's all about faith, brother. It's all about faith. Well, what about doing what the Torah says? Keeping kosher, keeping the Sabbath, doing the things that God asks, not doing the things that we manufacture, that we think God's going to accept, which in some cases he does, in other cases he reaches its limits. No, it's all about faith, brother. It's all about faith. Well, yeah, that's right. It does start with faith. But the Spirit then empowers us to walk into the covenants. So if someone has ever told you that no one can keep the Torah, that's a person who doesn't understand faith and faithfulness working together. Of course you can keep the Torah. Not under your own power, though. By the power of the Spirit, you can keep the Torah. Absolutely you can keep it. That's why Moshe says it's Deuteronomy chapter 30, Parashat Nitzavim. It's not way up in heaven, Lo b'shama yimim. It's not way across the sea, so that you have to tell someone to go and get it for us or bring it to us so we can do it. Where is it? It's in your mouth and in your heart that you can do it. You can do it. Moshe says you can do it. And of course, Moshe knows because earlier in that passage, Deuteronomy chapter 30, earlier in that passage, Moshe promised Israel the reason they could do it is because God says, I will circumcise your hearts. You can do it if God circumcises your hearts. If God doesn't circumcise your heart, you can't do it. You can't keep the Torah. You may think you can keep it, and you'll fool yourself, and you'll pat yourself on the back because you think you're keeping it. But ultimately, you can't. This bears relevance to our look at the sacrifices, because the sacrifices were meant to also be done first with a heart of genuine faith. Then, all the sacrifices are done because of faithfulness to the God who, in fact, circumcised my heart in the first place. Why does God keep promising in Jeremiah and in Ezekiel and places like that I will make a new covenant with them and I will take out the heart of stone and I'll replace it with a what? A heart of flesh. Right, a softened heart. A heart that God says I can both, my spirit can work with and I can write my Torah on a softened heart. I can't write my Torah on a hardened heart. It's a heart of stone. It's stiff-necked. It's stubborn. It's not going to follow my ways. The heart of stone. So he told Israel, you need to allow me to soften your hearts. So nothing has changed from the Old Testament to the New Testament. The question, how were the Old Testament saints saved? By the same way that we are. Faith in the promised word to come, namely Messiah himself. So with that, let's turn and take a look at, logistically, the 5 types of sacrifices. We're in week 4, types of offerings B, the 5 types of offerings. We are on page 10. Thank you. I'm going to move rapidly through the first 3. The Olah, the Minchah, and the Shlamim. The reason I want to move rapidly through those is because, as I mentioned last week, they are non-expiatory. Even though the word kafar, the root word, shows up actually in Leviticus 1 verse, I gotta look it up. I think it's verse 10. You remember that word kafar? It's where we get our word kippur from. It's usually translated atonement. If these are non-expiatory, we shouldn't expect to see the word atonement show up, right? In a bit of a challenge to our exegetical skills, Leviticus 1 1. Vayikra el Moshe, Vayidaber Adonai Eliv me ohel moed lemor. He called to Moses, and HaShem spoke to him from the tent of meeting, saying, Daber el bnei Yisrael va'amarta alehem adam ki yachriv mecher korban la Adonai min habehema, min habachar, umin hatzaon, takrivu et korbanchem. Speak to the children of Israel and say to them, when a man among you brings an offering to HaShem, or God, from animals, from the cattle, or from the flock, you shall bring your offering. I'm still reading. In verse 3, Im Olah korbano min habachar zachar tamim yach ribenu el patach ohel moed yach riv oto l'ratzon lifnei Adonai. That's where the verse stops. If one's offering is a burnt offering from the cattle, he shall offer an unblemished male. He shall bring it to the entrance of the tent of meeting voluntarily before HaShem. Verse 4, V'samach yado al rosh ha'olah v'nirtza lo l'chaper alive. Kaper. He shall lean his hand upon the head of the burnt offering. Lean his hands like that. The burnt offering, by the way, that's the Olah. And it shall become acceptable to him to atone for him? I thought this was a non-expiatory offering. What gives? Let's read. Expiatory, it serves to deal with sin on a direct level. You're God, I'm the worshiper. Before I can approach you, the sin in my life has to be dealt with on a sacrificial level. And so the type of offering that I bring to you is in direct proportion to the type of sin that blocks my communion with you. You don't just bring there's not just one generic offering for all sins. All sins are not the same. In one sense, all sins are a missing the mark. The Hebrew verb chata means to miss the mark. The Hebrew noun Chata'at is one of our names of our offerings. But basically, not all sins need to be atoned for in the same way, and that's what we're going to learn. In the case of the offerings of the 5 types, the first 3 are not even dealing with sin to begin with. So the reason I read this particular passage and mentioned the word kafar, the root word kafar, which means atonement, is because the burnt offering itself, the Olah, which we're going to read about, quite often was paired with other offerings. And before the other offering, the secondary offering, the korban sheni, could be accepted, the korban, the first one had to be offered, the korban rishon, the first offering had to appear before God, and then the second offering could come along, and that first one was usually the Olah. Now let's read about the Olah real quick. I don't want to spend a lot of time on that. I want to get down to the meat of the sacrifices, which is actually the Chata'at, sin offering, and the Asham, guilt offering. Because those 2 offerings themselves speak more directly to sins both intentionally and unintentionally. And we're going to have to look at that in order to understand the apologetic section that we're going to deal with later on. What I also want to do, let me just say this by way of an intro. Coming up next week, week 5, is our first intermission. You guys remember you have your syllabus there? Intermission, sha'ul utshuvot, questions and answers. So I hope you've been kind of thinking of questions as we've been going along. If not, this is your opportunity tonight to write down questions that you might not have had answered yet. Write them down on a scratch piece of paper. And then when we show up next week, the entire hour is dedicated to addressing questions and answers that are related to what we're studying. Okay? So I don't have any material that we're going to cover per se. I don't even know if I'll tape it. We'll see. I don't know if I can get the responses from you guys on the microphone. And if that's the case, it won't go up on the internet that way. So we'll just do the ones where I'm monologuing the way I'm doing now. It's up. Is it? How many? It's marked as just, what is it? I was going to say I can check right here. I can't remember how I marked it. Let me see. Do I have internet access here? You missed last week. If you guys ever do miss a class, I upload them as soon as I can. As soon as I can take them home and edit them and do what I need to do with them. Who's never been to our website? Most of you been there? From the home page, there's what's called a global navigation section. That just means that from the home page, there's a blue bar that appears across the page, that no matter which page you turn to, unless you're opening up one of my commentaries, that blue bar stays there. That's global navigation. Right about there, it'll say commentaries. You click on that, and then it'll open up, and you'll see a list of some of the commentaries offered. The Torah portion commentaries that I write, the festival commentaries that I write, the more lessons. More lessons is just other topics. Click on the more lessons one, and then there's a list, probably about 20 or so at the moment, and it's very near the bottom. It's called Towards Understanding Sacrifices and Atonement, and the audio files just keep growing. Just, part A, part B, part C, part D. So that's what's going on. So it is there. And then, of course, I'm trying to date stamp these. Today is what? The 4th week? January 20-something? 28th? 2008? Okay. Good question, by the way. So, yeah, write down your questions if you have questions about, if there's stuff I don't cover. Because next week, that's what we're going to do. We are going to just... My goal is I interjected those intermission sections so that I would go like 4 or 5 sessions and then we'd stop and everybody would kind of get caught up. You know how it is? Because as adults, we kind of go into the class with all this interest, 1st week, 2nd week, 3rd week, 4th week, 5th week, we're zoning out. We lost the teacher somewhere back 2 or 3 weeks ago. So by, the class is 14 weeks long. By the 14th week, we're lost. We got lost somewhere in week 2 or 3, and the guy didn't stop and take questions. So I refuse to fall into that trap. Been there, done that. Got the T-shirt, see? So I've decided to make these little sessions in the middle where we can just stop and everybody can start kind of catch their breath, as it were. Take a break and get caught up. What's that? My shirt? Actually, it is. It's got Korean here. So it says Suk Myung. He's right. All right. Sorry. At least the sharp man in the tie on the front row. All right. Page 10, number 4, types of offerings. B, the 5 types of offerings. I want to move quickly through the first 3. I'll just read them. If I have to stop and answer questions, I will. There are 5 principal types. You're going to learn some Hebrew words. Olah means burnt offering. There's your reference there in Leviticus. Minchah means grain offering, or sometimes I think KJV translates it as cereal offering. You're going to find out why it's called grain in a moment. I mean, it's obviously it's bread. It's like a loaf. And then the third one is called shlamim. If you're hearing the word shalom in there, that's right. That's probably the root word for shlamim. Peace offering. Olam. Almost. I thought it sounded like the Spanish word. Hola. ¿Cómo estás? Muy bien. ¿Y tú? Okay. The fourth one is Chata'at. Remember in Hebrew there's no cha. It's cha. There's Chata'at, sin offering. And then the 5th one is Asham, guilt offering. Some of you might be asking me why it's important to know the Hebrew words. Because Hebrew doesn't always have word-for-word English equivalents. And so you'll find one translation that says, you shall bring the burnt offering. And then you'll find another translation that'll say, you shall bring the fire offering. And you'll find another one that says, you shall bring the elevation offering. You're like, which one of them is right? Well, they're all trying to translate this word Olah, which has the notion of both fire and elevation or ascension. Has both aspects. And it doesn't capture neatly over into English sometimes. So it's helpful to just know what the original word really was in this case. So I'm not going to quiz you on it or anything. I'm just trying to help you out. The first 3 of these could be considered free will offerings brought before HaShem. You guys know HaShem, yeah? God? HaShem? Okay. By anyone at various times in the life of anyone in the community. The last 2 were required to make restitution for various sins. In other words, in plain English, as if that doesn't make sense, you could bring an Olah, a Minchah, or a Shlamim at any time, and it didn't necessarily say that you sinned before God. Other times, if you had known sin in your life, before you could approach God, an offering had to be brought to deal with the sin. Now, on a larger scope, before you can approach God, sin always has to be dealt with. But that's why we talked about the Tamid offering last week. There was a continual burnt offering twice a day, 2 lambs, one in the morning, one in the afternoon, that were always going on the fire. Those, in some sense, were already an atoning invitation to everyone who wanted to come. Come approach me. I've already got a lamb burning for you. You don't even have to kind of really worry about that. But the Olah was kind of neat because, as we're going to see, the Olah could be an animal, and it could be a large animal or it could be a small animal. This tells me that if you were rich in your community and you could afford to get rid of a lamb or a goat or something like that, then you could bring this type of offering. Free will. But if you weren't so well off and you didn't own any animals, God accepted birds. Isn't God neat to think of these things in advance? The first three, I read that one. The last two were required to make restitution for various sins. Such korbanot, that's, remember the word korban means offering. We're going to find there's another word for offering as well called zavach, but we'll get to that a little later on. But the primary word for offering is korban. And we use the word korban because korban has the root word karav, which means to draw near. The action of the word karav means drawing near, one object drawing near to another object. And because the sacrifices are called korban in the singular and korbanot in the plural, the sacrifice is seen as the device that draws the two people near to one another. In this case, God and man. Sacrifice is that medium between the two that draws the two parties close to one another. It's very obvious to see how that points towards Yeshua. Yes? Right? Yeshua is the sacrifice whereby we, man, can draw near to God through Yeshua. And Yeshua is the device or the sacrifice whereby God drew near to man. God moved towards man and man moved towards God, and it's through Yeshua, the perfect sacrifice. That's why we want to know that word korban, which has its root word karav, which means to draw near. Okay. Let's see. Such korbanot, the Chata'at and the Asham, are referred to as expiatory. The expiatory korbanot shall occupy the bulk of the latter part of this commentary. Now let me turn to a website that is maintained by normative Jewish authorities. There's no Christian axe to grind in this website. Why did I turn to normative Jewish authorities to get my definitions here? Unfortunately, the Christian church, in their position of divorcing themselves from the mainstream Israel and from the Torah as a document of teaching, leaves themselves devoid of some very important information when it comes to the sacrifices. It's no secret that in standard Christian parlance or standard Christian theology, that the sacrifices are all done away with in Yeshua. And that because Jesus came, that's why the sacrifices are done away with. So why would we ever want to study about sacrifices? They're never coming back anyway, right? Okay, that's according to standard Christian, prevailing Christian theology. Sure. So, what ends up happening is if we want to study the sacrifices, I don't say unfortunately we have to turn to the rabbis of old or turn to the Jewish sages. It's not unfortunate because they have preserved that for us. Paul even says so. To them were given the oracles of God. He said so in Romans. So that we know that when the Gentiles were grafted into Israel, aka Romans 11, then it was to the benefit of the grafted in branches to learn from the existing branches. So that's what we're doing here. We're practicing learning from our fellow Jewish brothers, things that we seem to have either finessed, forgotten, shoved aside, pushed off to the corner, fill in the blank. You guys following me so far? All right. So Chabad.org is going to supply us with our standard descriptions of the first three korbanot. There's your footnote number 12 to show where that link was taken from if you're interested in going and reading more of their stuff. The first one, the Olah, the burnt offering, the first korban, the first sacrifice to be described in the book of Leviticus is the Olah, the ascending offering. Remember, see that word Olah? It can mean burnt. It's translated in some versions as burnt, others as ascending. And we who don't know Hebrew get confused and say, well, which one is it? It's both. Commonly referred to as the burnt offering, whose distinguishing feature is that it is raised to God in its entirety by the fire atop the altar. That is to say, if I were bringing an Olah to God, whether it's from the herd or from the flock or it's a bird or whatever I'm going to bring them, after the priest officiating cuts its throat and collects its blood and splashes it on the altar, the little copper altar out in the courtyard, the chutzner, the bird, the animal itself is going to go on the altar, which is about 7.5 feet by 7.5 feet, and it's going to go completely up in smoke. That is to say, none of it's going to be kept by me or the priest. None of it's going to be eaten by me or the priest. All of it goes to God. It's a complete burnt offering. All of it goes up to God. That's why it's kind of a unique type offering. It's really special. The sages had a fun time midrashing with this particular one. The Olah can also be a male sheep or a goat, in which case the same procedure is followed. Doesn't matter which animal it was, the whole thing gets burnt. A turtle dove or a young pigeon can also be brought as an ascending offering. Again, God is conscious of the different economic statuses within the community. If he just told everyone that they have to bring a sheep or a goat, I mean, how much does a sheep or a goat cost? And where do you get one? And then I just got to take it to God, and it gets burnt up in smoke, and I watch it go up in smoke, and then that's it. Wow, what an investment. But if you have like 100 sheep, then it might not be such a bad thing. But if you only have one, it's like the stock market. God says, I want you to offer your BMW up on the altar. Well, not everybody drives a BMW, right? Okay, so God is aware of our economic status, and we could read back into this offering all kinds of lessons if we'd like to. God doesn't say, okay, everyone has to give $100 to me. Not everyone has $100. God says, give what you can. And in this case, everyone from the rich to the poor can bring an Olah, is what God's saying. I accept all of your offerings. Now, he did limit what you could bring. You couldn't bring dogs. You couldn't bring squirrels. You couldn't bring roadkill. Okay? There were limits as to what you could bring within the parameters, but the parameter was very diverse enough that depending on your economic status, you're going to be able to approach God with this type of offering. Does that make sense? A turtle dove or young pigeon can also be brought as an ascending offering instead of being slaughtered through shechita, which just means cutting of the throat. The bird is killed by malicha, which is a nipping off of the head from the back of the neck, kind of like this. If I could just like that. The blood is applied to the wall of the altar, and the bird's crop and its adjoining feathers are removed and discarded, and then the bird's body is burnt upon the altar. So again, it's the emphasis on these details is that it's an entirely burnt sacrifice. It's funny because we're going to read that. I pulled some of it right into here. He asked the question, what's some of the commentary here? I pulled one in. Upon analysis, we see that the daily Olah service involved 3 different locations in descending holiness. Because what happens is, if you've got an altar and you're burning animals on it continually, the ashes are going to pile up sooner or later. And so God instructed the priests to make first the animal on top of the altar. That's like the holiest place where the animal is. But at some point in time, the animal gets reduced to ashes, and they have to take some of these ashes and put them next to the altar. They can't leave the courtyard. The courtyard itself is holy, and for the priest to go in and out of it just arbitrarily, when he comes back in, he'd have to wash again. So they piled them up next to the altar for a while, and then when the time came, they got taken out to a ritually clean, designated place outside the camp of Israel. So there's kind of like three levels of the animal. It started out on the altar, that's the holiest, and then next to the altar, that's kind of a little less holy, and then finally it ended up way out there. A certain rabbi by the name of Abraham Isaac Kook, and he lived from 1865 to 1935. He was actually the first chief rabbi of the land of Israel. In fact, he was appointed that position before if you look at the date there, it was before Israel became a state. He was appointed chief rabbi of a state that didn't exist yet. He was fond of saying that the burnt offering, the Olah, was a metaphor for the very highest level of contact between man and God. He was just trying to midrash. He's trying to answer your question, David. People would say, why is it always burnt up? What is God trying to say to us? Besides the fact that God says that it is a what does he say? Concerning the burnt offering, in verse 9, the very end, it says, he shall wash its innards and its feet with water, and the Kohen shall cause all of it to go and smoke on the altar. A burnt offering, a fire offering, a satisfying aroma to God, a satisfying aroma. The re'ach nichoach la'Adonai. People might ask, what does that mean, a satisfying aroma to God? Is God sitting up in heaven going, like I said last week, he's up in heaven going, smell those burnt animals. Is that what God's doing? No. God sees more than just the animal on the altar. He sees the person who brought it. He sees the heart of the person who brought it, the obedience. So there obviously is more than what meets the eye. At least there should be. So let's read a little bit. For Rav Kook, the fire on the altar reflects sublime experiences of inspiration and prophecy. At this level, the material world is no consequence. The fire totally consumes the flesh of the offering, freeing man from the shackles of his physical reality. The kindling of the holy flames on man's soul is outside the framework of normal life. Such divine interaction is beyond the ordinary structures of human existence. both individual and collective. Why? Because the Olah offering burns on the altar all by itself. There's nothing else on the altar. In the case of an Olah, you bring the Olah, it goes on the altar. The God doesn't say, okay, let's maximize this. Let's throw some other stuff on there. Hey, let's throw some barbecue up there. The priest has to eat too, right? No, the Olah's there. It's like I'm God, and you're going to bring this Olah to me. And so for that brief moment, you've got my full attention. You bring the offering, the priest officiates, puts it up on the altar, and it burns. And for that brief moment, it's me and you, David, me and you, no one else. I'm not going to divide my time between everyone else. The Olah burns there by itself. I'm not going to have the priest burn like stray documents at the time, kindle up some firewood, light up his lunch, warm up his lunch at the same time. God's not going to do that for you. He's going to say, this 7 by 7 altar, it's yours for now. Isn't that kind of neat to think about that? Okay. All right. So I hope that kind of answers some of those questions. Let's move on. I'm going to move fast for the first three because I got to slow down for the last two. Minchah, grain offering. Minchah. The verse says, and a soul which shall offer a meal offering to God. It's interesting, the rabbis of old, the Chazal, the sages, the poskim, they like to try and ask different questions with the text. They would practice a technique called midrash, where they would dialogue with the text. The text would say something, and then they'd look at another text that said something, but one word got changed. And they would then ask questions of the text. Why did you switch words? Why in this case did you say when a man brings? Such as in the case in verse 3, it actually doesn't even say that someone brings. It just says if an offering is brought. Literally, Hebrew says imo Olah korbanot, and then it starts describing where it's from. It doesn't say who brings it. But this particular one, the Minchah, starts off v'nefesh ki tachriv. V'nefesh, the word nefesh in Hebrew means soul. Why did Moses write when a soul brings a Minchah? But he didn't say when a soul brings a Olah. Owing to the assumption that God doesn't just waste words. He doesn't just arbitrarily say, hey, I didn't say nefesh before, but I'll say it now. Every word has some meaning in there. We may not know what the meaning is, but God's trying to tell us something if we would just dig a little deeper. So that's why I have the verse written there, and a soul who shall offer an offering to God. Meal offerings called menachot, or gifts in plural, are prepared of the fine flour with olive oil and frankincense. The priest removes a kometz, which is a handful that he could grasp with 3 fingers, and it's to be burned on the altar. The remainder is eaten by the priest. Notice the difference? First of all, it's not an animal. There's no blood in a minchah. Ergo, it's not an atonement type of sacrifice. Okay? The word minchah refers to gift. Gift. What is it? Perhaps maybe that we're saying we're returning to God a gift. We just want to bring a gift to God. You ever want to give something to God? You've seen the old preachers talk about, okay, I'm going to give my tithes and offerings to God, and they take out a bunch of money and they throw it. Here's the deal: I'm going to throw this money up to God, and whatever comes back down my way, I guess, is mine. Whatever God wants, He's going to keep. Throw the money up. Right. A minchah is a gift offering to God. You're not asking God for anything. You're not saying, God, please give me a pink Cadillac. You're just saying, God, I love you, and I want to show you. And in this simple way, where you've prescribed a cake, a cracker, a wafer, a loaf, or whatever it is, because there's 5 types of minachot. Whatever it is I want to give you, this is what I'm going to give you. And no animals are needed. And God accepts this. There are 5 types of donated meal offerings. There's the standard meal offering, whose kometz, whose handful is removed before it's baked. Number 2, the baked meal offering, which came in 2 forms, loaves, and or 3, the flat matzot. 4, the pan-fried meal offering. And 5, the minchat marchashet, the deep-fried in a pot offering. So the differences between the 5 are just the way it got prepared. It does. It sounds like you guys getting hungry? Yeah. It's southern fried minchot. Yeah. Yeah. So, and what's neat is if you go back and look, you brought basically this offering before it was cooked. You didn't cook it first. You brought it in its raw grain form, and you mixed it up right there on the spot. And the priest took a portion of that, a pinch of that, the 3 fingers. He pinched it. Actually, I think it was those 3. He pinched the 3 fingers. Actually, he did it with 3 fingers, and he put that little bit on the altar, and the rest he actually fried up or deep fried or whatever, depending, baked it, and the priest ate it. And the priest is God's representative. So now you're starting to answer how the priest got fed, huh? Right? The following rule applies to all meal offerings, including the loaves. No, God says, bring bread to me, bring it to me. I love gifts. But here's some restrictions. No meal offering which you shall bring to God shall be made leavened. What does leaven typify? Sin. Very good. God's saying, you're offering a gift to me, make sure it's sinless. Okay, don't put sin in your offering. Don't bring sin up to me. Don't offer sin up to me. I don't want sin on my altar. Yeah, there's a word picture in and of itself. So we can't offer something mixed, sin and proper ingredients mixed together doesn't work well in God's altar. There's a lesson there that I'd like to go to, but I can't right now. You just have to get Mark's commentaries on this. No meal offering which you shall bring to God shall be made leavened, for you shall burn no leaven, nor any honey. Why not honey? We'll talk about honey later. Nor honey in any offerings of God made by fire. Another rule is that your every meal offering you shall season with salt. Salt gets put into every minchah. In fact, salt gets applied to every offering. You shall season with salt. Never shall you suspend the salt covenant of your God. Salt was actually part of a covenant with God. Hey, put the salt in there. This latter rule applies to all korbanot. With all your offerings, you shall offer salt. So salt gets thrown in there. It seems like such a simple detail, but God is so wise. And I mean, to be honest with you, I don't understand all of the intricacies. And who knows why God said what he did. We just know that he's God, we're not. He knows better, we don't. So we don't question his ways in this particular case. He calls us salt. Yeah, salt's a very unique type and shadow throughout the Bible. It has all these neat teaching tools that come up out of salt. You're right, we're called salt too. Matthew chapter 5. We're called salt and light. Another meal offering mentioned here is the Minchat Bikurim, which is also called the Omer. Now watch this. It's brought on the second day of Pesach, Passover, from the year's very first barley harvest. In this minchah, the kernels are roasted by fire before they're ground into flour. In addition, a meal offering accompanied all animal offerings. So if you brought not an Olah, but if you brought one of these others that we're going to talk about, the Shlamim or the Chata'at or the Asham, then the minchah was included with that. It's part of the other ingredients. So that's interesting. What I was going to say is that the only offering that I'm aware of off the top of my head where bread is involved being offered up to God and leaven gets included is the Shavuot offering. The Shavuot, the Pentecost offering. In the middle of the year, around June or July, that one does, leaven gets put into that one. Question. They are eating all of it. The question was, if the priests have to eat this, are they eating all of it? Yes. That's actually a very good question, because when we get down to the next one, when we talk about bringing an animal, that's a lot of beef. So the shlamim, kind of in anticipation of your question, the shlamim offering coming up was usually a community that brought this animal. Remember, the Olah got burnt up. No one ate it. The minchah was small. It's just a little loaf of bread, something the priest could eat. The shlamim is an animal, but it doesn't all get burnt up on the offering on the altar. Parts of it get removed. Its kidneys, its some of the inner organs get removed. The fat, the chaylev that gets removed and put on the altar, and that does go up in smoke. But then parts of it get eaten by the priests and the participants, and they can actually leave and come and go as they partake in this meal. It's kind of like a camp out / barbecue. They were. Retroactively, I might add. God actually says that, since you're asking this question, were there consequences, she asked. I have to repeat your question for the people on tape. In the shlamim, you basically said to God, okay, I want to bring this offering as a group. Typically what had happened was a family would come, a dad, a mom, their kids. They would come to the altar or come to the temple or the tabernacle as a family, and they would bring their animal in tow, and they'd say, we want to offer a shlamim. And so when the priest heard the term shlamim, he thought, okay, great, food for me too. He got some, you got some. But what ended up happening is you had to eat it think in the biblical terms of a day, a night, a day, a night, a day. That's 3 days and 2 nights, right? Day, night, day. You had that time period to eat it. So basically you took the priest did the shechting, where he cut the throat and you leaned your hands on the animal. In some cases you actually even slit the throat as well. But after the animal was butchered and the priest did all the dressing and put all the stuff on the altar, and it started going up in smoke on the very first day. There may be leftovers. If there's leftovers on the third day, you have to burn them all up. If you didn't burn them up on the third day, if you stayed one more night, everything you did on the first day has been invalidated. Your offering's not allowable. Retroactively. Isn't that kind of odd? So you had to plan this thing out. We're going to eat this on the first day, first night, second day, second night, third day. And whatever's left gets burnt up on the altar. The priest can say, hey, this is great beef. I think I'll save some of this, make jerky out of this later on or something. Or you couldn't say, hey, there's a whole leg or a side of a cow left. I'm supposed to help go slaughter a cow tomorrow morning, by the way. You guys want me to bring you pictures? I got some fat in my car right now if you want to see it from the cow we slaughtered 2 weeks ago. My boss is a butcher, and he knows how to, and he's Jewish as well, so we go slaughter his cows. Great beef too. Black Angus cows too. So we got this whole side of beef left. You think, what are we going to do with this? What are we going to do? God says, you got to burn it up. If you don't burn it up, then that first day's offering that went up on smoke, God says, I'll look back 3 days ago and go, that's not valid. You're thinking, but I already did it. That's like after the fact. God says, doesn't matter. You got to plan this thing out. So does that kind of help answer your question? Eating all these. Well, if we have and it would be if we thought that every time a person sinned they had to bring an offering, but that we're going to find out that that's not the case. Otherwise, there'd be scores of people lined up for every little sin that they've done. What we actually find is in the Torah that many of the sins didn't require any type of sacrifice at all. Okay, and then what do we do if the temple's too far away? Just for that little family, whoever brought that. And God's not. It's not. Sometimes God would say, if you mess up here, I'll cut you off. But God is like the law of today. The Torah is not written in such a way that on your first infraction you get punished. You get pulled over for speeding, and if the cop's having a good day, he's within legal limits to give you a ticket. But many times he may just say, "Slow down. I'll give you a warning." That's it. Yeah, God's the same. Here's a kal v'chomer argument, light from heavy. If A is greater than B and B is greater than C, how much more is A greater than C? If the earthly cop is gracious, how much more is God gracious? Yeah, you had to be a repeat offender. The Greek bears that out if we ever look at the Greek verb tenses, which are more expansive than the Hebrew verbs. But basically, you had to be a repeat offender to where your life is characterized by that sin before God really got upset and said, "You're out of line, buddy." Especially when we're talking about death penalty scenarios or being kicked out of the camp, which is about the same thing. The death penalty known as karat, which we're going to get to. Good question. Shlamim. The shlamim or peace offering could be either male or female and either from the herd or a sheep or a goat. In other words, it could be a very large animal or it could be a smaller one. Like the Olah, its blood was sprinkled on the altar, but unlike the Olah, which ascended in its entirety on the altar, the meat of the shlamim was eaten by the owner. The one who brought the offering, the two portions of the animal, the breast and the right thigh, were eaten by the priests. Only certain parts of the animal were burned atop the altar. The fat that covers the innards, and here's the verse, that parentheses inset, the fat that covers the inwards, and all the fat that is upon the inwards. It says inwards there, but it means innards. But it's interesting that it says inwards. And the two kidneys and the fat that is on them, which is by the flanks, and the appendage of the liver, which he shall remove with the kidneys. Those are the things that the priest would pull out when he's cutting the animal open. Those would go up on altar to God. In other words, you couldn't eat those pieces. That's not to say that those pieces weren't kosher. You guys understand what I mean? It was a kosher animal to begin with. It was not a pig. So only kosher animals are going up on the altar. If the peace offering is a sheep, the whole fat tail up to the backbone was also added to what I just read. And the priest shall burn it on the altar. It is divine food, a fire offering, a sweet savor. Again, the word we read earlier, the phrase, the Hebrew phrase about that, it goes up to God and that he smells this. Again, that's anthropomorphic language, right? Assigning body parts to God. Because they are offered to God on the altar, these specified veins of fat, which the Torah calls chalev, by the way, are forbidden for consumption in all animals. Later on, we're going to find that there's a prohibition. God specifically tells Israel, when you guys kill animals and you're not offering them up to me, that is to say, if you start to think about this carefully, if you were living in ancient Israel, most of your animals, because many of the people were agricultural, right? Most of the animals that you had were for offerings. You weren't eating the animals on your daily diet. You were more vegetarian-based diet, or you're eating smaller things like chickens and things like that. birds that weren't normally offered up as easily. Does that make sense? So if you had larger animals, or if you had a plot of land and you had a cow, you're not eating your cow because you suddenly get an inkling for hamburger that night. You cut up your cow and it's like you're eating your tractor. Who's going to plow the crops tomorrow? So you probably didn't slaughter your cows, that your cows or your oxen. You got to be kidding me. I don't recognize the number, so off it goes. Sorry about that. So you guys get the idea. They weren't just eating the animals all the time. You remember the story when they were in the wilderness and they complained to God, "We want meat, we want meat. We want something to eat." And God gave them manna and then he gave them quail as well. They complained about not having anything. What about the animals? Well, they realized that, gosh, if we eat the animals, we can't offer anything up to God. So they weren't eating the animals as readily as we do today. We just kind of go to King Soopers, we buy a slice of beef, and we take it home and fry it up and eat it. Back in ancient Israel, it wasn't that simple. There weren't marketplaces, at least not the desert yet. Keep in mind, we're talking about the period of the tent where they're in the desert for at least 40 years. Then they move into the land. They still have this tabernacle. Then they finally develop like communities, lands, markets, and then they can start bringing in more. And God does say in Deuteronomy, yeah, if you want to eat meat and you don't want to bring it to me as far as a sacrifice, I'll let you do that as well. Otherwise, if you cut an animal's throat in at a certain point in time, that blood better be offered up to God. Otherwise, you're in trouble. You're not out in the back behind your tent, cutting the throat and bleeding the animals so you can have barbecue the next night. God's going to be upset about that. Basically, God says, that's mine. Because the blood is mine. What are you doing with the blood? You're pouring it out on the ground? I hope so. Otherwise, the blood goes on my altar. That's where the blood goes. So that kind of helped fill in the picture of the sacrifices. I want to move now past the 3 voluntary offerings into a section where we're going to deal with the expiatory sacrifices. What do I mean by expiatory? Let me just give you a kind of a standard dictionary definition. The word expiation is a verb, and it means to atone for. Atone for what? Atone for guilt or sin, right? Expiatory, atonement. We're now going to move into the more important or the more critical types of korbanot that we read about in the book of Leviticus. This next section is entitled Expiatory Sacrifices. A quote from the JPS commentary to Leviticus is in order before we study these last 2 types of korbanot. I need you to follow along with me very, very carefully now to this section in my commentary, all right? Quote, chapters 4 and 5 contain the laws governing expiatory sacrifices, the purpose of which is to secure atonement and forgiveness from God. These offerings are efficacious only when offenses are inadvertent or unwitting. We're going to talk about those 2 in a moment. They do not apply to defined or premeditated crimes. Whenever an individual Israelite or a tribal leader or a priest or even the chief priest or the Israelite community at large is guilty of an inadvertent offense or of failing to do what the law requires, expiation through such sacrifice is required. JPS goes on to say, the laws of chapters 4 and 5 here in Leviticus do not specify all the offenses for which such sacrifices are mandated. Did you catch that? The chapters don't really lay out exactly what these types of offenses entail. Instead, we may assume, they go on to say, as did the rabbinic sages, that there is a correspondence between those offenses requiring the expiatory offerings and those punishable by the penalty known as karet. Now, karet is the cutting off of the offender from the community. The person was, to use today's parlance, we would say they were excommunicated. They were put outside the camp back in those days. The expiatory sacrifices, JPS concludes, are required for inadvertent transgressions that, if committed defiantly, would in fact bring the offender the penalty of being cut off from the community. Karet, end quote. The footnote number 14 you'll see is from Baruch A. Levine, the JPS Torah Commentary to Leviticus, Jewish Publication Society, 1989, and that was lifted from page 18. It's very important for you to listen now that we understand the category of sins being described here. Basically, there are 2 categories of sin that Leviticus is describing for us, and that's probably why we don't simply get an enumeration, a list, a simple list. Although when we get to the let's see, is it when we get to the sin offering, we're going to see that some of it's spelled out, as well as some is spelled out in the guilt offering as well. But it's important that we understand for now that the Torah does not clearly describe sins of intent in easy-to-understand terms. To be sure, unintentional sins are represented by a very technical term in the Torah known in Hebrew as bishgaga. We're near the bottom of page 11, about to move into page 12, so follow along with me in the written notes if you can. Bishgaga. All right? This is a word that's found only 6 times in Leviticus altogether. We're in the top of page 12. Look at the footnote number 15, and you'll see in Leviticus all the locations where this phrase bishgaga, the root word is shogeg, where this word shows up. Now, why do we care? Listen on. Tim Hegg is going to remark on bishgaga in this short excerpt lifted from a commentary out of his on the topic of forgiveness. Quote, this is Tim Hegg. A study of the words unintentional and intentional when describing sins reveals something different, however. Okay? Intentional and unintentional. In Leviticus 6, verses 1 through 7, the sins for which a person may bring a guilt offering, remember the word for guilt offering is Asham, the sins for which an Asham is required include lying, theft, fraud, perjury, and debauchery. All right? Those are actually spelled out in the Torah. Yet in Leviticus 4, the sins of a leader or a common priest for which a guilt offering may atone are called unintentional. And the Hebrew is bishgaga. Now, in Tim's opinion, or Tim's, in his opinion, this is not actually a very good translation, this word unintentional, however, because it makes it appear as though one can lie, steal, defraud, perjure oneself, and engage in all manner of debauchery without direct intent to do so. You catching me? You catching what I'm saying here? The Torah lists some of the sins under the category of Asham, and then it calls these unintentional. And yet it sounds as if a person can say, well, I lied, but I didn't mean it. I committed fraud, but I didn't mean it. I stole something, but I didn't mean it. That's why he says the word unintentional is not necessarily the best translation. Actually, Tim Hegg goes on to say this word does not describe one's attitude or intentions in the matter. Okay? When we say unintentional, it really isn't describing the person's attitude towards the sin that he's committed, but simply, he says, the class of sins for which there exists a prescribed sacrifice. In other words, it's just a technical category, this bishgaga. The basic meaning of the word means mistake, and thus the English translator's word unintentional. It didn't mean to happen. It was not intentional. It wasn't meant to happen. It happened by mistake. And so, therefore, if you think about it, the person bringing the sacrifice can have one intention, and then a different result may happen. So you see how I mean that the word unintentional may not exactly point to the intent of the individual. It's really just describing the category of sin. Tim Hegg goes on to say the basic meaning of the word is mistake, and thus the English translator's unintentional. But it also simply means unacceptable behavior. It's something that shouldn't have happened. It was wrong. What is striking is that nowhere in the Torah are intentional sins described. Now we're going to contrast. Nowhere does the Torah actually say, here's an intentional sin, and then tells you what it is. Rather, Tim goes on to say, the opposite of so-called unintentional sin, that category, is the category what we call of a high hand. And the Hebrew is biyad ramah. The sin of a high hand, as in Numbers chapter 15, verse 30, the incident where the man gathered sticks, on the Sabbath day, and then the Torah talks about sinning with a high hand, and then we move right into the mitzvah about wearing tzitzit. Numbers chapter 15. Now, Tim goes on to say that this describes rebellion, this biyad ramah, the sin of a high hand. Take your hand, take your left or right hand, it doesn't matter, raise it up, close your fist and kind of wave it heavenward. That's kind of what we might think of the word picture that comes to mind when the Hebrew says biyad ramah. The word ramah means high or elevated, ramah, and the word biyad means of the hand. So of the hand that is upraised, the upraised arm, the sin of a high hand. This describes rebellion, a sin for which there's no expiation. This describes the intention of the individual. This describes the attitude of the individual. And it's still a category sin. but God is able to see through to the heart of what's going on here. It is rebellion, and for this, God says, no expiation for you unless you get your heart right. Thus, as long as a person persists in his rebellion, Tim Hegg goes on to say, there is no means of forgiveness here, people. Only when this person turns from his rebellion and seeks atonement through the prescribed sacrifice is he in fact forgiven by God. The animals in and of themselves and by themselves cannot bring the required atonement that God says is offered. It requires a change of heart. It requires a broken heart. Rebellion is not allowed. There are therefore only two classes of sins described in the Torah, Tim Hegg says. Bishgaga, usually translated unintentional, for which there is no expiation, and biyad ramah, the high hand, for which I read that wrong. Bishgaga, unintentional, for which there is expiation, Tim Hegg says, and biyad ramah, the high hand, for which there is no expiation, end quote. I lifted that resource of Tim Hegg's. You can see footnote number 16 down to the bottom of page 12 at TorahResource.com, English articles under forgiveness. Let's continue. Levine, in the JPS commentary, continues to Leviticus to explain the Asham and the Chata'at. Let's keep reading. Quote, in substance, chapters 4 through 5 prescribe two principal sacrifices. What are they? The Chata'at and the Asham. The object of the Chata'at, usually translated sin offering, was to remove the culpability borne by the offender, that is, to purify the offender of his guilt. You can read chapter 4 of Leviticus, verses 1 through chapter 5, verse 13, to read about the Chata'at. All right? The Asham, usually translated guilt offering, was actually a penalty paid in the form of a sacrificial offering to God. Notice the language penalty. You ever been to court and had to pay a fine? Yeah, that's kind of what's going on, right? The Asham, it applied when one had unintentionally misappropriated property that belonged to the sanctuary or had been contributed to it unintentionally. In other words, he gained something that wasn't his by mistake. Or, in certain cases, when one had sworn falsely concerning his responsibility toward the property of others, false testimony. A false oath brings God into the picture. Why? Because the oath is made to God. I swear, in court session again, you raise your hand, you say, I swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, nothing but the truth. Typically, when you say that, where is your other hand? It's on the Bible. Right, we're bringing God into the picture. That's why the Asham is described this way. JPS goes on to say, the sacrifice did not relieve the offender of his duty to make full restitution for the loss he had caused another person. Very important phrase there. Just because God forgives us on the heavenly court doesn't mean that we don't have to remunerate. Hard word to say. We don't have to pay back that which was owed to our fellow man, the person that we wronged. That's what it means to pay someone for services rendered or for work done. To pay them back, as it were, for something that we owe them. We work for them, or I'm sorry, in the case of the phrase remunerate, remunerate. We pay someone for services rendered. In the case of where we wrong a certain man, we have to pay them back for that which we wronged them. The sacrifice did not relieve the offender of this duty. In fact, JPS goes on to say the offender was fined 20% of the lost value. So if I steal $100 from my fellow man, whether I knew it or not, and then I get caught, according to the rules of the Asham, right, then I not only had to pay him back the $100, but I had to pay him $20 more, a fifth, 20%. So I had to pay him $120. That's what the Torah is trying to tell us here, okay? The Asham merely squared the offender with his God, whose name he had taken in vain when he swore to take this oath. And so that's why we need to know the details about this. You can read chapter 5, verses 14 through 26 to read more about this particular detail about the Asham. My quote from JPS, if you'll see, footnote number 17, Baruch Levine, the JPS Torah commentary to Leviticus, Jewish Publication Society, 1989, again, page 18. Let us provide now a brief description of the Chata'at and the Asham respectively, and then we'll bring this part of my commentary to a close. Okay, just real brief. This section, or this paragraph is entitled Chata'at, sin offering. The sin offering proper is a sacrifice consisting of either a beast or a fowl, and it's offered on the altar to atone for sin committed unwittingly. It's bishgaga. The rules concerning the sin offering are as follows. If the anointed priest or the whole congregation commits a sin through ignorance, well, then the sin offering is a young bull without blemish. It's a larger animal. Should the ruler so sin, notice how we're going downwards in level of authority or downwards, we're diminishing our level of leadership here in this example. Should the ruler so sin, his offering is a male kid without blemish, a smaller animal. But when a private individual sins, his offering must either be a female kid or a female lamb without blemish, or if he's too poor to provide one of these, then a turtle dove is also acceptable as a chata'at, a sin offering, okay? Sin offerings were brought on other occasions as well. Remember, on the Day of Atonement in Leviticus chapter 16, the high priest inaugurated the festival with two Chata'ot, two sin offerings. We had a bullock as his own offering and then a male kid for the congregation. Those were both considered Chata'at, sin offerings. The flesh of these offerings was not eaten. But after the fat had been removed, that chaleb, that forbidden fat, the carcasses were burned outside the camp. You can read about that in Leviticus 26, verse 3, verse 5, and verse 10. And 11, as well as verse 25 and 27 of chapter 26. Also, concerning the Chata'at, a woman after the days of her purification, remember when she was in Nida? And we can read about that later on in the Torah as well. After she had gone through this purification time period, after the end of it, she also was required to bring a dove for a sin offering, and it was called a Chata'at. You're thinking, gosh, all she did was go into her menstrual cycle. Why is it called a sin offering? Well, it's a technical term for a technical korban. It doesn't necessarily mean that she sinned. Just like we talked about earlier, the Olah uses the language of sin in that offering, but it doesn't necessarily mean that the person sinned. In addition to a burnt offering, this woman brought the Chata'at. So she brought both a Chata'at as well as an Olah. A leper, by the way, on the day of his cleansing, and we read about him in Leviticus as well, and also we read about him just in Leviticus. A leper on the day of his cleansing was required to bring, besides other offerings, a female lamb, or if he were too poor, a dove for a sin offering, a chata'at. You can read about that in Leviticus 12, verse 6, as well as Leviticus 14:10, Leviticus 14:19, and Leviticus 14:22. Finally, we're on our last offering. We've gone through 4 of them. Let's hit the 5th one. The Asham, known as the guilt offering. This last little paragraph here, we're near the bottom of page 13. Torah.org is going to give us some information concerning this last one. Quote, the Asham offering has many applications. Like the Chata'at, or the Chatas is what they say, it is a sin offering. However, the Asham atones for intentional sinning. Intentional sinning? Yeah, it's still a category, and it's not sins of a high hand. It's slightly different than that. It's not b'yad ramah. It's not rebellious sin, but it is intentional sin. Swearing falsely is one such example. God is the unseen third party who is present wherever and whenever one man has dealings with another. That is to say, we don't want to simply say that sins are unintentional. We don't want to simply say that lying, swearing falsely, perjury, those things. We don't want to say simply that they are unintentional, because typically when people do these things, when they lie, they are intending to lie. So we can say unintentional and intentional. It's kind of both. I'm not really trying to confuse you, but what I'm trying to say is it's not rebellious. It's not b'yad ramah. It's not that category. It still falls under the category of bishgaga. Unintentional. It was a mistake. It was a mistake. Swearing falsely is a mistake. Okay, lying is a mistake. It's something that shouldn't happen. It's something that is wrong. Okay, it's sins that shouldn't happen. That's what I mean by unintentional/intentional there. God is the unseen third party who is present wherever and whenever one man has dealings with another, even if no other witnesses are on hand. If you swear, then God is there because his presence is everywhere. God himself is the guarantor for the honest dealings between men. There's 3 parties really involved. If I swear to my brother that I'm going to do something for him, God is the unseen third party. If, therefore, this guarantor is invoked as a witness, if I say I swear by heaven, then any factor in these dealings has been disavowed when any factor in these dealings has been disavowed, I go back on my word after I've already sworn by heaven that I'm going to do it, then is it not, it's not merely an act of ordinary faithlessness. It's not merely that I just broke faith with my fellow brother. I promised to do something for him. I swear by heaven that I would do it. I didn't follow through with my promise. I didn't do it. But also, I'm guilty before God. That's the point. In these cases, the offender has pledged his priestly character, his relationship to God, as surety for his honesty. End quote. That's what Torah.org is trying to get us to see. And because of this, the Asham needs to be brought into the picture. Okay, it's a little different than the sin offering, the Chata'at that we just read about. A standard Judaic offering, or a standard Judaic definition of the Asham, might read something like this. It's a guilt offering. It's an offering to atone for sins of stealing things from the altar, for when you are not sure whether you've committed a sin or what sin you have committed, or for breach of trust, like we just described. Stealing things from the altar? Come on, people. Who would steal from the altar? The Hebrew word for guilt offering is Asham. When there was doubt as to whether a person committed a sin, the person would bring an Asham, if he wasn't sure if he sinned or not. Because by admitting sin, then he brings a Chata'at. But if he says, I'm not sure if I sinned or not, then an Asham was brought rather than a Chata'at. Because again, bringing a Chata'at would constitute admission of the sin, and the person would have to be punished accordingly for it. See the difference between the two? If a person brought an Asham and later discovered that he had in fact committed the sin after the fact, well then, oh yes, he would have to bring a Chata'at at that time if it was proven that what he did was in fact a commitment of sin, and then he had agreed to it. Oh yeah, I did do that. Well then it automatically retroactively turns from an Asham type of guilt to a Chata'at type of guilt, and the type of offering changes. And Asham finally was eaten by the Kohanim. That's another difference between the Chata'at and the Asham. The Chata'at, if you remember, wasn't eaten by the priest. It was burned up on the altar and such, whereas the Asham was actually eaten by the priest. And for now, that's going to do it on this section of the 5 types of korbanot. That concludes our show for today. It is my desire that this continuing series of teachings will assist the average non-Jewish believer or new Messianic Jewish believer in his desire to become a more mature child of God. And now, O Israel, what does the Lord your God ask of you but to fear the Lord your God, to walk in all his ways, to love him, to serve the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul, and to observe the Lord's commands and decrees that I am giving you today for your own good. To the Lord your God belong the heavens, even the highest heavens, the earth, and everything in it. Yet the Lord set his affection on your forefathers and loved them. And he chose you, their descendants, above all the nations, as it is today. Circumcise your hearts, therefore, and do not be stiff-necked any longer. Because the Torah is written on the hearts of all who truly name the name of Yeshua as Lord and Savior, it is meant to be followed to the best of our ability. We have no reason for fear of condemnation or the trappings of legalism. My name is Ariel ben-Lyman HaNaviy. The intro and outro song were written, produced, and performed by Ryan Kingsley. For more information on contacting Ryan, you can reach me by email at Yeshua613@hotmail.com. That's YESHUA613@hotmail.com. Or visit our website at graftedin.com. That's graftedin.com.